everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Nicole Lamberson. I was trained as a physician assistant and I volunteer doing outreach for the film Medicating Normal, and I host conversations like this one today. Our guest today is James Hall. James is a self-proclaimed regular guy. I love that. With 15 years of professional experience in data and analytics in the private sector. After being injured by a new psychiatric treatment called Transcranial magnetic stimulation, which we'll call TMS for short, he is now raising awareness and helps others through a Facebook group, a podcast, and a website. He's also authored several pieces on TMS harms for MAD in America. So James, thank you so much for being with us here today. Is there anything you'd like to say, as an introduction that I left out, or about the film Medicating Normal, if you've seen it, etc.?
I love the film, and thank you for the invitation, Nicole. I think we all have different expertise and all this really valuable stuff we bring to the table. And it's funny and kind of ironic is that really I'm just a regular guy. Like I was just working, minding my business, doing my own thing when all this kind of came upon me and I ended up getting injured. So I think that's the value of my perspective and how I help people and stuff. It's like, I'm really just a really basic, normal person for a lot of respects. And the way I look at all this stuff is from that framework. Like I'm not an MD. I liked biology in school. Like I like the sciences, but that's it. Like I'm just like anybody else in terms of my background in education,
Okay, awesome. So we talked about this a little bit before we went live, you and and I told you the reason I wanted to have you on today is because, our film Medicating Normal is really about, what can happen when we overdiagnose people who are just having normal life, stressors and things that we all experience like grief and sadness, anxiety, that kind of thing. And then it's also about the potential risks and harms of taking psychiatric medication. So TMS, doesn't really fall within the realm of what our film covers. However, I do feel like we get the question all the time at the film, well, you're pointing out the harms of one of the most utilized treatments, which is medication. And so if you're going to do that, and we all agree with the film and we say, oh my gosh, meds are risky and we're not going to take them, then what are the alternatives? And just being a regular person on Facebook and the internet, I've seen a million ads pop up for this thing called TMS and have wondered myself, like, what is it? Do people actually get this? Are there risks to it, et cetera? And so because TMS is an alternative that I feel like some people seek and that's highly advertised, it was important to have you come on today and, talk about TMS and your experience with it. So I think for people who are listening, who don't have any idea what this thing is, can you give, a brief introduction to TMS?
Absolutely. So transcranial magnetic stimulation. So if you went in and got it done, you go in and you sit in a chair and they would either put a helmet on your head or they would have a mechanized arm come over and put, a piece of machinery like real close to your head. They'd get proximity to your head. And then what's at the end of that machine or what's in that helmet is these incredibly strong electromagnets. And when you look at TMS being advertised, they'll say, we're sending magnetic waves through your head. And that's the therapeutic mechanism, which there's no proven therapeutic mechanism for TMS. So they don't know how it works. They will describe all kinds of things to you. But if you look at the literature and you look at the proof behind it, they don't know how it works. Same thing with ECT, coincidentally, there's no proof of a therapeutic mechanism. It's just, they try to do these studies and just point to results and say that it works. Mm-hmm. So the thing is that you cannot create a powerful magnetic field without using electricity and creating an opposing electrical field. Now, if you told people, oh, we're putting an electrical field through your head, right, they may have some hesitancy. So you can see why they conveniently leave that out. But the fact is that the electrical field is there. If you go look at Wikipedia and you look into more research-based place that are looking at the physics of TMS, it's in plain language that electricity is involved and it's used in the therapy as well. So this machine, most of them are like our 1.5 Tesla and up to like 3. So this is the approximate same power of an MRI, right? And so they'll say, hey, it's the same as getting an MRI. Well, we don't sit in the MRI for 20 minutes at extremely close proximity. You know, MRIs are a little bit further away from your head, which is very important because that makes less energy transfer. And we also don't get MRIs every day for like 2.5 months, 2 months straight. Because with TMS, a course of TMS is you go, well, I went every single day for like 40 treatments, 45 treatments or something, somewhere in there, or like 30 something. And so you're repeatedly exposing yourself at a much closer proximity to this electromagnetic wave. What they may tell you, or what they tell you, is that stimulates your neurons, because we know the brain is based on electrochemical activity, you know, and parts of your brain that aren't stimulated, like with depression, become stimulated, and then you're not depressed anymore. So that's kind of the definition of TMS.
Okay. Some parallels to medication that I hear is we don't really totally know how it works. That's in the FDA pamphlets with your medication. They admit that. Yeah. And then when they say repeated exposure, you know, of medications, they're much safer, we know, when you take just one pill once in a while for a rescue dose or something like that, like for flying, you know, versus taking them every single day. So, okay, so let's jump into your story. Since you had TMS yourself, let's start with, like, why did you decide to get TMS? You know, did you try medications before turning to TMS? Did you research it before you started going down the TMS path? We can start there.
Yeah. There's this, I'll go back and tell a little bit of prehistory with meds, because what's really important is that people see the repetitious history behind psychiatry and the way it works. And that'll tie deeply into what TMS is and how it's promoted now and how it's utilized. So, and the film is so brilliant because it's about medicating normal. And that really comes down to our core problem, I think, as like a Western like ideology. So when I first went to psychiatry, I was taught growing up inherently that psychiatry was not a good thing. It's like, you don't want to be there. You don't want to have to take pills to be happy, right? So I had this natural deterrency for it. I'm working at like a stressful corporate job. So I do this for years, right? Chronic stress over years doesn't end well for anybody. And anyone plainly knows that, right? But we still put ourselves in these situations. So here I am, I have a breakdown at work. I got a bad boss, all this bad stuff's going on at work. And finally, I'm just like, can't handle it anymore. Like crying at work, you know, in this really bad state. I go see my doctor, my GP, and he's like, I was in the same spot as you, you know, this happens. He's super, super empathetic, really fantastic guy, right? Very helpful. And he's like, I'm going to take you out of work. Don't worry about it. Cause I'm super stressed. I'm like, I'm going to get fired, whatever, you know. He's like, take you out of work. He's like, my daughter went through the same thing. Here's some Lexapro, you know, just start taking this and you're going to feel fine. Like everything's going to go be great. So I take these sample packets of Lexapro. Everyone that is read in knows how that got there and why he has these thoughts and all that stuff. You know, pharma rep was there giving him free stuff and telling him all the ways you can prescribe Lexapro that aren't approved. So I'm having all this psychological trauma and I have Lexapro. So I go home super happy because my doctor's like pulling me out of the situation. I'm gonna get some relief. Well, I started taking the Lexapro, and I didn't know this at the time until later in the community, but I started having akathisia. Like I could not rest. I could not sit still. And I call the doctor's office like in complete akathisia is not like panic, right? But like in a constant state of panic and agitation inside, my brain will not shut off. All these things I've never experienced in my life, I had an idea psychiatry wasn't great. So I call him. I'm like, I need to see him now. Like, this is like in a complete emergency. Like, I can't keep taking this stuff if it does this to me. So the nurse is like, no, you can't. So I do the classic wild thing that people typify as, I go to his office. I'm like, no, like, I need to see him. I'm going to his office and I'll just wait in there until he has a moment, because he's a really nice guy. So the nurse is like, you can't be here, whatever. Like, I'm like, no, I need to see him. You don't get it. Like, I'm in an extremely bad state. Like, so he finally sees me on the side. He's like, just calm down and keep taking him, and it'll just resolve. Like, just give it 24 hours and results. I'm like, I can do that. I go home, keep taking him. It doesn't resolve. It's like getting worse, if you can imagine it. So I end up going to a psychiatrist because I realized everything is out of hand. I'm like, at least this guy will get me on target. So he gives me Buspar to even it out. And it actually did calm me down. So now I'm like, didn't realize that I'm getting polydrug now, right? And I'm having this bad side effect. Instead of saying this drug doesn't work, he's like, let's add some drugs in there. He gives me a benzo. He gives me Buspar. And now I'm at home laying on the couch sleeping all day. And I'm like, okay, I'll get through this, whatever. So this is my introduction to psychiatry. This happens over and over again. I go through this same cycle like 4 or 5 times every time I'm under this inhuman workload at work. And instead of acknowledging that my job is toxic and taking care of myself, I keep trying to push through, and I keep listening to this voice that a lot of Western society has. Is like, you just need to work harder. You just need to take what the doctors give you and everything's going to be fine. So I finally I break down after breakdown. I'm like, this is a cycle. The way I'm healing and getting back to normal is I'm exercising and eating well, and I'm cycling the drugs out of my system. And all of a sudden, and I get some time off work. I get a few weeks off work, a month off work. I'm like, okay, I'm good. I can go back. Right. And then, so after a while, I finally realized that was the answer. So I'm like, I'm never going back to psychiatry again. I tried 20 or 30 drugs, and it it always made me feel horrible. It always destroyed me. So I'm healthy. I still have this impact at work though. So I go through these periods where I'm very depressed. I have generalized anxiety disorder. I can't stop worrying. So I go to see, and I switched from MDs to DOs because I was like, these guys don't push drugs. They're more into physical medicine. This is where I'm at. I exercise and eat well and take care of myself. So I go to my DO, and he's like, we could try Wellbutrin. You haven't tried that before. He's like, but I don't like drugs. But there's this TMS therapy. There's this new thing. It's completely safe and effective and non-invasive. And you just go and you sit under a machine for a while, and it puts this magnetic wave through your head. It it stimulates your neurons. It's all really safe. Nothing bad can happen to you, and this is happening. And then you're just happier. You just slowly get happier, and then not only does your depression go away, it could go away forever. You may never have depression again because of this stuff. And I'm just like, wow, that's heavy. And I work in the tech sector, so I guess I have this kind of idea. It's like, oh, maybe technology can save us. Maybe we're so advanced that maybe technology instead of medicine will solve this problem. And he also tells me this little anecdote. He's like, soon every doctor will have one of these machines in his office, because so many people suffer depression. They'll just have a room. People just go in there with their depressed. I can't believe I fell for this, right? People just go in this other room, get a little zippy zap on their head from this magnetic wave, and it'll be good. And everybody in the world will be happy, because as soon when they're upset,
right,
they'll just do this treatment. So it was like Inception. It was like the movie. He implanted this idea in my head that there was this perfect treatment there was no risk for. The worst thing that would happen is that it just might not work for you, right? Because it has 80% efficacy. So some people it doesn't work. Most everybody works for it. So I start looking online. There's nothing bad about it online. My wife is like, it's a bad idea. It's too good to be true. And I'm like, look, I did my research. I present this stuff to her. I'm like, look how safe. We can't screw up. I say, yeah, maybe it won't work, but we can't screw this up. And so I did a few days of research. I was so eager to get rid of my depression that I've been dealing with on and off for the last 10, 15 years, that, I basically pushed my family into letting me go and going and starting it. And that's how I landed in there.
Okay. So just for clarification, the quote that you gave about it works for 80% of people or whatever. That's what the doctor's telling you in the office.
Yeah. So it's great spot to break and talk about that statistic. So clinics will say like up to 80% efficacy. They have some methodology for measuring how efficacious it is. And then, but if you look at it, right, like I've talked to thousands of people about TMS now, and the biggest thing that happens is there's really no benefit, right? A lot of people walk away from it thinking they have some kind of benefit. It's this placebo, this temporary placebo thing. And then quite a few people are harmed by it. And there's a really small group of people. Of course, TMS advocates will disagree, and that's fine. But for me, talking to thousands of people, like there's a really small group of people that say they benefit, right? And like anything else, like the devil is in the details. If we look at the data, if we look closely at what people's actual experience was and what happened versus a survey that just asks you if you're feeling better, right? Every patient that comes through your office, are you feeling better? Yeah, I feel better. Okay, great. That means this treatment worked perfectly and you'll never have side effects and everything's great, right? Like that's so benign. It's so unhelpful. But yet these are what people are doing to sell TMS. When I look at it closely and I talk to people that are unaffected, the primary mechanism of action, like in these situations, there's a magnetic field that goes through. There's also an electrical field that goes through. And this destroys human cells. Like it takes an extremely small amount of electromagnetic activity directly applied to the brain to cause electroporation and expand the cells and to cause harm and then to cause cell death in the brain, right? So when you look at this, like when you have a brain injury, the primary thing that happens is your cognition gets distorted. Your cognition becomes less, like you're not sharp. So what I was seeing with a lot of these people when I probe them and ask them more questions, they're actually harmed, but they're really not self-aware anymore. And we see this with meds. We see this with ECT. We've seen this with a ton of like insulin shock therapy. Like the farther you go back, the more you see is that people are being harmed into saying they're okay. And it's the same thing with TMS. And from the beginning all the way till now, like I'm continually blown away by the vagueness around the actual science and the lack of information being reported as a positive result, And so those efficacy numbers, they are so not as reported. Like you see some that are like, oh, like you see some studies are like 20% effective. You're like, if this treatment is so great, how can you have someone reporting 80% efficacy and then someone down at 20%? Are you looking at these people long term? Are you giving them cognitive tests to see if they're even able to report a result? And I mean, in my experience, just again, being a regular guy talking to people and looking at the data that is available, I can look at a study and see there's nothing behind this study. Like there's no detailed information for me to draw a conclusion about. And those are the great studies, right? And I look at some other studies that are reporting epilepsy and seizure and other really unpleasant stuff, right? And I'm like, okay, well, at least I'm getting some detail here, right? And so the efficacy rates that I'm seeing, like, it's negligible when you look at placebo, right? There is not efficacy. I'm seeing different manifestations of harm and then a really small population that reports a benefit. But when I look at that, I look at ECT, I look at these other treatments that we know cause a tremendous amount of harm, and they're reporting the same small group of people that are recovering as well. And really when you look at the harm that they're receiving and you look at their recovery, you're like, they're trading one thing for another. They're trading harm for a temporary reprieve. I had one lady that I wrote something about ECT and TMS similarities. I said, ECT is not okay, right? And she said, ECT saved my life, and I'm like, I find that hard to believe, but if you want to talk to me about it in detail, I'm glad to. And she wanted to, and I was like, okay, like this is my chance. Like I really want to hear this gal out. And she had 4 treatments of ECT. She had severe depression, and it knocked her out of her depression. She's like, I was going to end my life. I didn't end my life. And I was like, well, how is your depression now? She's like, I still have it. My life is still very, very hard, but that saved my life at that time. Right. And it's like, I understand that. I understand that these treatments can put us out of an extreme state, but when you look at long-term consequences of ECT and what we're going to see with TMS and what we are seeing with TMS is you're trading a much worse set of long-term consequences for some sort of short-term gain, right? It's really just a psychological perception, or our body does give off an endocrine response that makes us feel better, right? Like if you get shot at, that next morning, you're going to feel great, right? You're going to have the best breakfast of your life. You're going to be so thankful for your life, right? Like your central nervous system sends you good feelings saying like you just escaped something horrible. Like you'd be thankful to be alive, right? Some people not so much. Some people aren't that lucky, right? They're the victims of trauma. But that is what I've come to know to be true based on what I experienced with medication and looking into it in the same window, through the TMS window, and my own harm and all the harm I've seen in others.
Okay. So let's get through the rest of your story then. So you decide you're going to get it. Your family's sort of hesitant, but you convince them. Now tell us about like, what did it feel like? How many sessions you got? And then like, obviously when it went wrong, how did you know? And that kind of thing.
Yeah. And this will all help fill in questions people have about what I've just said. So I go into the clinic. The employees there, they're fantastic. They're very kind. And I honestly didn't feel like they were trying to sell me something consciously. I think it came out of their own ignorance. Like they're not neurologists. Like even neurologists struggle to understand this stuff. They're not like biomedical electrical engineers who understand the impact that this treatment would have on a person. They just know that people come in and then they leave and they're okay. Right. So they come in, they're like, it's going to be great. You're going to be better. Almost everybody leaves out of here feeling better, so they're selling me this thing. And I'm in data and analytics. So I know there's a story to be told that isn't always told. So I look at these ladies in the face and I'm like, no, really. I'm like, how do people leave? Like, it can't be quite as good as you say. Like, is this really the real deal? How many people get hurt? And they're like, no one gets hurt. Everything's going to be great. I'm serious. Like, it's cool. So I start relating these ladies, building rapport. We build this rapport. I really, really trust them. And then I decide to do it. So I get this preliminary PHQ-9 that's like assessing my depression. And interesting thing that happened is that it wasn't quite low enough because I had like this moderate depression, right? So they're like, well, if you change these numbers, maybe you should consider more seriously like how you feel, because if these numbers were better, it would be easier for us to get insurance approval. So at the time I didn't notice, but I look back at it, I was like, well, like I'm having an okay day today, but historically I've been much worse. So I'll write that in, right? Little I know, like they're really not supposed to be doing that. It's kind of a fraud. But they're just trying to help people. That's their perspective, right? So I get in there. And so then I go in, there's this chair, they do this mapping session where they're testing to see how you respond to the treatment. And they're finding this general location on your head where they can apply the treatment. And so when they do it, they see if your hand twitches, and then they start applying the treatment to you at like a low strength. And so my hand twitches a little bit, they move it until my hand's not twitching. And at the time, of course, I didn't know this, but there's generating electrical current in your head, which is activating neurons that go all the way down your spinal cord and activate the muscles in your hand. And when you do this too hard, this is how seizures happen, right? Like, so they're poking the bear that's a seizure, right? But they're doing it in such a way where they know they won't evoke a full seizure. So they're trying to make sure they can give you the treatment without evoking a seizure. To me, that's terrifying, right? But again, it's not what they're telling you. They're telling you like, it's a safe thing. So they do this, they get the machine in the right spot. It has this memory. They're like, okay, come back tomorrow and then we'll start doing treatments. Come in for 20 minutes a day for like 35 days. If we need to go a little bit longer, we will. So I'm like, okay, cool. I leave. I'm like, all right, that was nothing too crazy there. I probably felt a little bit fuzzy at that time, but nothing that, like, no red flags. So I go back the next day and Now I just sit there normal. We go back in the exact same positions. They turn on the machine, and it's this clacking, clack, 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 clack. It goes for like a 20-second interval or something. And then it gives you like a 10-second break, and then it clacks again on you. And they're initiating the electromagnet with extremely high or rapidly alternating electromagnetic pulse. It's like, for in human terms, like tons of times a second. They're switching the polarity of the electrical field that's going through your head, which we don't see as anything, but all the atoms and molecules in your head are all reacting to this swift change in polarity. And what that actually does is, within the cells in your body, it expands the cell walls, and then until they break when it happens for long enough. And I've written about this in my article in Mad in America, and like it's really freaky. Because in there you don't know, but you know something's not quite right. Like there's this clacking and this unpleasant sensation you're getting in the side of your head. But again, everybody's there to assure you that it's perfectly safe and effective. And so that's what I was. I'm sitting there, and I finish. I'm like, okay, that's fine. Nothing really of note. And then I leave. I come back the next day, and they're like, well, we need to turn up the machine. And I'm like, what do you mean you need to turn up the machine? You did not tell me anything about like turning it up. Like now they've inferred this sense of like something's going to change and we're going to do something different to you. And when they say turn it up, like you automatically think unpleasant. Like, why wouldn't it just be full strength to begin with? There has to be some unpleasantness or something that's going to happen. So they turn up the machine, and this is when the red flags start to fly. Like they turn up the machine, they go through it. I was like, that's kind of unpleasant. And it's a very ethereal feeling. Like I didn't know exactly how to describe it. I'm just like, it doesn't feel good. And what this was my cognition being distorted. Like, so when I left there, I didn't feel quite right. I drove home. I went back the next day. They turned it up again. And I think it was after the second or third treatment, I drove home and I felt drunk. I was having a hard time staying in my lane. I wasn't aware of the cars around me. Like we had crossed a line there that from previous life experiences, like, I know this is bad, right? Like this is not cool. I get home, I'm like, tell my wife, I was like, you need to drive me. I can't drive to these treatments anymore. So I go back and then I report to them. I'm like, hey, I feel drunk. I feel stupid. Like, is this going to interfere with my job? Is this going to do these things? They're like, no, you're going to be fine. It's going to totally be fine. It all just goes away. It all resolves. Didn't resolve. It got worse. And then you asked me when things got bad or when I realized things got bad. Here's the thing. I never realized things were bad because my cognition was so poor, I could not help myself. And it's called anagosia. I'm probably saying it wrong, but with psych meds, Peter Bregan writes about this. There's a point where you can no longer identify your own injury. And that's what I was experiencing in kind of a different paradigm with this TMS. Is like, sometimes I could hardly remember my name, like, or what I was doing. I couldn't operate a vehicle. And I'm supposed to be so clear-headed that I can say, wait, this treatment's harming me. Like, and I can't go here anymore. I got 2 or 3 people that are telling me it's all going to go away, and they're convincing me everything's going to be fine and to just get through it. And yet I'm supposed to override these people that appear as medical professionals, or at least good, healthy, kind advisors that are just looking out for me, and do it. I mean, my wife is like, you look okay, you seem fine. I don't see any overt harm. So if you want to keep doing it, it's fine. So we're like, okay, well, we'll just keep doing it because we can't really identify the harm. And people are telling us it's going to go away. So the entire rest of my treatment, I have this belief. The rest of the treatment is based on me having a belief that these are all temporary and it's all going to go away. So I do more treatments. Another red flag that came up that I just blew by was I woke up in the middle of the night with screaming tinnitus, which if you're a good neurologist or you've studied brain injury or brain activity, you know that poor cognition, tinnitus, these things that I'm experiencing, these are all hallmark brain injury symptoms. Like, and as a neurologist, you could not ignore that. But as an untrained technician who knows nothing about the brain, ironically, has no idea. And their boss or their trainers, whoever the manufacturers were, could tell them all day, like, it's fine. They're good. They'll be fine. They'll walk away fine. right? They won't report any long-term results to you. You don't have any knowledge of how your patients are when they're done with treatment, but you're supposed to think they're fine. So I have this screaming tinnitus, and I go in and I'm like, hey, I had this really bad episode during the night, which I described in my article, but I go in, I report it to them, and they're like, okay, have you had tinnitus before? And I'm like, not really. I've been to loud concerts and I had ringing, but always resolves. And they're like, it'll resolve. It'll be fine. Don't worry about it. Like it's a, situational thing, whatever. I'm like, okay, you know, fine. My wife, she's had tinnitus before too, or ringing in her ear. So she's like, it'll resolve. It'll be fine. It comes and goes. I'm like, okay. It never leaves. It's always there. And now I finished my treatment, and there was another point where I got towards the end of treatment, and I'm like, is this really going to resolve? You told me it would resolve like within 2 weeks. They kept giving me this small time frame and never did. And they're like, don't worry, at least 2 weeks after you're done with treatment, it'll be fine. They keep stringing me along. It never resolves. I talked to the doctor at the end of treatment. I'm like, at this point, I realized I probably got screwed. And I'm like, man, like, this isn't cool. Like, I still have tinnitus. I have cognition problems. I lost my job. Like, my life is not at all what it was when I started. And he's like, and okay, so you asked about a red flag moment or the moment when I knew I got screwed hard. It was here. He goes, it'll resolve within 2 weeks. If not, you probably developed some other neurological problem and you want to go see a neurologist. And I'm like, oh my gosh, they just screwed me. Like, now they're passing the buck saying that a guy with like immaculate health developed some or other magical neurological problem when he was in the middle of this like new treatment. I'm like, this is such a load of crap. Like, no way. I was like, oh, I put my hands up and I was like, I was about to rage and freak out and like break everything in the office and start screaming. I was like, they got me. I'll just walk out of here, because getting committed or getting put in jail is not going to help the situation, right?
Yeah.
So I walked out, and it's been almost 4 years since, and I have the same problems that I had then.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry that happened to you, James. That's awful. So in the 4 years, have you improved at all with time, or is it about the same as it was then?
So you develop these over my journey. I developed these coping mechanisms to deal with my cognitive impairment. I've never been able to go back to work. The tinnitus is still there. It's not quite as strong, but you develop these ways of like making it your friend and getting comfortable with it. So it's more that I just don't hear it as much, and there's this improvement. My cognitive problems are still there. I had some extreme issues afterwards that have started to resolve. Like, so what I started researching electrical injury, and there's these, you can get extreme fatigue. My doctor diagnosed me with chronic fatigue syndrome, like extreme chronic depression, panic attacks. These all occur with brain injury, but they've been specifically noted with electrical brain injury. And some of these extreme symptoms that I had right after treatment that developed, and it's also a delayed onset. And so things got really, really bad after I got out of that office. I had a few weeks or maybe a month where I was just really screwed up and funky, and I was just trying to let things settle. Well, after that, things got really, really bad. I started having panic attacks all the time. I had severe physiological depression, which means I was incapable of feeling anything, and I had no energy to do anything. So so I just could feel my neurological system just shutting off. And I continued to exercise and to stretch and eat well through all of this stuff. So for years afterwards, I did this, and eventually some of that emotional stuff started to resolve. I still deal with it. But there has been some recovery, and I try to tell myself every day, you've had a great recovery, but here I am 4 years later, like still struggling day to day to try to break through barrier and just get well and just feel good. And that's just extremely difficult.
Yeah.
So I think you understand. I think you understand.
Oh, 110%. Absolutely. Just different mechanism of injury. I took medications that a lot of the things you describe, I could say I feel too. So, and for years. So you said that the doctor at the clinic, the TMS clinic, essentially tried to say you developed some new neurological injury, perhaps in the time in which you were getting the treatment. But you've been disabled now for 4 years since then. And I'm wondering what's the reception like with other physicians that you've encountered?
Yeah, it's so long ago now. I've really thankful for the community. You have taught me so much. When I didn't believe in myself and I was believing the doctors, like it was such a big problem. So when it first happened, my idea was that I magically was the only person that ever got hurt by TMS, and that I was experiencing some weird medical oddity, like an episode of House or something. And I was the patient, and I had to go try to figure it out and get help for some other problem I had developed, maybe as a result of TMS, or maybe I half believed the guy that like I had developed some sort of other injury. So I'd go see neurologists. Well, I see GPs and then neurologists. Same thing. TMS can't hurt anybody. All of them had heard of it loosely. One of them had been to a few seminars on it and knew more about it. And he's like, it can't hurt you. Like, this stuff's going to resolve. And I'm like, it's been 3 months, doc. Like, it's not resolving. Like, and it's just as strong as it was. Like, this is not happening. So there was this generalized kind of gaslighting going on. They're like, well, we'll just wait. We'll just wait, you know? And I'm like, I want to find out what happened. So we're doing a lot of diagnostics, but there's a lot of disbelief. And then with a particular neurologist, I started getting more and more forceful, like the more time went on, right? And I'm like, dude, I can't remember anything. Like, I have these cognitive problems. You have to be able to quantify this, or at least figure out what happened in some way. You know, we'd done some MRIs with and without contrast. There's nothing there. So I'm like, I want a cognitive test. So he gives me this really basic one. It's like, connect the dots. There's like 15 dots. It's like a couple word scrambles and a few really simple things. And I was able to do them. And he's like, look, he's like, you're fine. You can do this stuff. I'm like, this qualifies me for kindergarten. Like, doesn't tell me whether I can continue work at my job or try to get another job. You know,
Yeah.
this is not adequate. And he's like, you're fine. Like, I'm talking to you, you're fine. And I'm like, but I can't remember things when people tell me, like, if someone tells me a story, the next day I don't remember anything. If two people are talking to me at once, I can't even tell what they're saying. Like, this is not, for you, it might be okay. Like, and compared to the way I used to be, this is miles and miles from that. And he's like, okay, well, you can get a neuropsych test, but don't have any expectations, you know, is whatever. I'm like, I don't care. Just give me the test. Like, I'll keep going. So I go and I get it. This really great neuropsychologist administered the test. I started telling her, she believed me like right away. And she's like, well, yeah, let's see what's going on. It's very interesting. And she's like, TMS could hurt you. She's like, any treatment could hurt you, you know? So let's see. We do the testing. I'm like 15 minutes into this test, just doing like basic math. And I'm like sweating. I'm like, whew, you know, like, and I'm like writing this stuff down. Like, I'm trying to add up numbers in my head, the basic math. And like, I'm like distressed and I'm really stressed out. And I'm like, can I take a break? I'm 15 minutes into like a kind of a simplistic test for humans, and I'm exhausted. And she's like, yeah, take a break. This just gives you an idea. I started crying a couple times during. We get to the end, and she's like, yeah, you have cognitive impairment. And she starts going off all the categories in which I can't function. Like, I'm in less than one. I function as well as less than 1% of the population. She's like, when it comes to like recalling stories, you can't recall anything. You know, she's like, if you try to multitask, you can't function at all. Your function drops to zero. She's like, so if you were to try to work, you would have to be in a silent room. Like, no one can come and interrupt your work. You'd have to have extremely basic work to do. You know, she starts going through all this stuff, which basically comes down to like nothing you could actually do, you know? And I was like, okay. And then she started giving me some coping mechanisms. She's like, you know, if you keep yourself in a quiet environment and you avoid these distractions, all this stuff, you should be able to, you know, not have panic attacks. Because every time I was trying to do stuff, or if things got loud, I would have a physiological panic attack. I'd start sweating, my brain would start screaming, I'd start shaking, and I'd be like, what is happening to me? This is not a stress induced, an emotional panic attack. This is a physiological panic attack. So that was one thing along the journey. I started to find doctors that would believe me, and based on the evidence I gave and the really strong testimony I gave, I was a very, very strong advocate for myself. I went from asking doctors what was wrong with me to telling doctors what was wrong with me. And I wouldn't accept any relationship with a doctor that was not equilateral. Like, after dealing with neurologists and psychiatrists that were acting completely idiotic, I could not accept that anymore. Like, I could have victimized myself and just been like, I'm just going to do whatever this doctor says. I knew I would have got hurt worse. Or I could admit to myself that it's quite likely doctors are not going to help me or incapable of helping me. So at a bare minimum, I'm going to believe and trust in myself, and I'm not going to do anything that I think is dangerous from this point forward. Because doctors, I mean, the first thing that the neurologist puts to me is gabapentin. Like, they're like, we need to slow your nervous system down and dull all your senses so that, you're more compliant, or, you're not experiencing the experience. I'm like, that's not an answer. Like, I'm in a really bad state, but like, I'm not gonna just drug myself through it. So I fired doctors. I went through a lot of doctors. I didn't put up with their crap, like, right away. Like, go in there and talk to them. And if they listened to me and accepted that it was possible it's harm from TMS, I'd be like, okay, I can work with you. We can have a couple more appointments and see. There's guys that they'd be like, it can't hurt you. I don't know what your deal with is. And they talk down, and I'd be like, no, I'm not going to put up with your crap. And I just fire them. That was an extremely stressful and horrible process for me, even though now I'm talking about it in a calm way. Right. But, I have a team, which they don't communicate directly, but I have a set of doctors, like an excellent neurologist he's a younger guy, and he just believes me, and that's it. And when we talk, he's never like, do this treatment. He's like, I'm considering this treatment. Here's everything I know about it. What do you think? And I'm like, I don't think it's worth the risk. Like, I don't want to do that. And he's like, that's fair. Like, there's risks. You could get worse, and we don't really know if it's going to help. So that's fair. And we have an equilateral conversation. I have a GP the same way. He's like, we'll try some supplement stuff, but if you don't want to take drugs, you don't have to take drugs, or if we don't have good evidence for a treatment, we're not going to do the treatment. And he's like, if you come up with a treatment that has good evidence, just give it to me. I'll read up about it and I'll approve the treatment for you. It's just a vastly different world than what, like, 90%, it seems like, what people deal with. They all go in the doctor with kind of a victim mentality, which I understand. When you're harmed and disabled, like, that's normal. But doctors take advantage of that in a lot of cases, and they're like, just do this, just do that, and just leave my office, and just do what I tell you. And
yeah. Sounds very similar to what I went through too as well. But thank goodness for the doctors who do believe us. When you advocate for yourself and you finally find one, I found one as well that she just believes me, and everything gets easier from that point if you're lucky enough to find one like that. So I'm so glad that you did.
I realized I had a trauma response too around doctors. Like, I would start panicking and sweating, like sitting, waiting for my appointment.
Yeah.
And I was like, why am I experiencing this? And I realized it's because I felt compelled to acquiesce to every doctor that I knew they would all be like, well, do this. And I'd be like, okay, I'll do it. You know better than me. And once I started to overcome that trauma, I did a lot better.
Yeah. It's so important to learn to advocate for yourself. I mean, you have to, because no one else is going to do it for you. All right. So let's get into more like the general things about TMS and harm, so that people listening can know like what to look for in themselves or other people, or just risks if they're considering this procedure. So what are some of the most common problems people report after injury with TMS, and maybe some of the like less common problems?
That's great. So some people, a lot of people have listened to the stuff that I've said, or read my articles and stuff, which is Awesome. That serves as informed consent. It's a rare thing that we get any kind of informed consent. At least I can offer some for people. And then they decide to do the treatment anyways. They think the risk could possibly outweigh the benefit for them. That's cool. I get that. So what people will generally experience that get into trouble is that TMS seems to either accelerate or decelerate your central nervous system based on whatever inputs are going through there. So some people will start to slow down and get really, really depressed. Some people will experience extreme anxiety. Some people will, so that generally almost every single time it comes with some manifestation of that, which gets unfortunately like really, really extreme. Like people will not be able to function. And the doctor will call that depression, but really your central nervous system has been retarded so far that you can no longer function. And it's not, you're not depressed, you're not, this isn't an emotional state. It's a trauma from the TMS. The other is excitation, where people cannot sleep. They get so, their system is so excited that they cannot shut it off. They become extremely anxious. Panic attacks come as a result of that as well. You know, a lot of stuff like that. Generally, almost everybody has some manifestation of that. So if you see those things ramping up or things are ramping down, it's not a good sign. People then experience, a lot of people experience tinnitus. So that ringing in the ears, that's not coming from damage to your inner ear, like from an external sound. It's coming from your auditory cortex inside your brain being damaged. That is unequivocally a bad sign. Like if you're developing tinnitus, like it means something inside your head is being physiologically changed, and now you're hearing an auditory sound from it, or a perceived sound. Some people, I did not get migraines. I'm really lucky. I did have headaches, but some people get like really extreme migraines that have never had it before. That's a really bad sign. And they say you can get headaches. Like there's a really small like consent they give you. They say, oh, you can develop headaches or sensitivity on your scalp where they apply it, right? A migraine is not a headache. Like that's a manifestation of neurological change as well. So if some people have had migraines and they get activated, I mean, people can evaluate for themselves if that's dangerous or not. But if you've never had a migraine before and then you start having migraines, that's really bad. People definitely, they get tachycardia. Let's see, I got a list. Balance problems, irritability is another big one. The reason why people get irritable is because their brain isn't able to process their environment the way it used to be. So you're getting too much stimuli, there's too much noise, there's too much light. Your brain is processing these things in a different way now, and it becomes jumbled. And then you get irritable, you get angry because your environment is frustrating you. It took me a while to figure that out. So irritability, cognitive impairment, that was my main thing. Like if you feel stupid, dumb, or ethereal, or you feel dissociation, that's what happens when you get hit in the head with a bat. Like if you're going through TMS and you're getting those symptoms, that's what it is. Like your brain is under attack, and that's a manifestation of it. It's confused. It's going through changes. The connections that were once there are not there anymore. So you can't have the same clear, crisp cognitive function. Those are the primary things that I usually see. Unfortunately, it's more rare, but this stuff happens as well. Epilepsy, people have developed epilepsy from TMS. One-time seizures as well, that's happened. Some people have had a few seizures or a single seizure, and then they just stop, they don't have epilepsy. Tachycardia, people will get intermittent tachycardia or postural tachycardia, where if they shift their body, all of a sudden their heart jumps up to 180 BPM. People get eye injury, unfortunately. People have had detached retinas. There's documentation from medical professionals that this has happened from TMS. But people have reported that to me and in the group as well that we have. environmental sensitivities, much like the irritation. Like if you start getting sensitive to light and to sounds, if people are talking to you and it seems overwhelming, things like that, that's from a serious neurological change. It's not something you just develop like all of a sudden, you know.
Yeah.
Um, the other one people get is sensitivity to substances like medications. Like if all of a sudden your medications are severely affecting you or dramatically affecting you, as well as like supplements, that's another big thing that happens as well. Now that I've learned more, once your brain is kind of experiencing this physiological trauma, what tends to happen is your hormones get out of balance and they start sending the wrong signals. So that might account for some of the sensitivities. It also could account for emotional like distress and up and downs. People have lost hair. Women often report to me, and they don't want to report this. So if I hear it, I take it seriously, like serious changes to their menstrual cycle. One gal, she's like, I have intense suicidal ideation on my cycle now, which never happened before. And I feel so bad for her. But based on the other things that I've heard, it's from TMS.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
that sort of stuff. Unfortunately, suicidal ideation is another one. People start feeling so extreme, and that becomes kind of a hallmark of TMS injury as well.
Yeah. Okay. So all again, similar to things people report from medication, psychiatric medication injury. It all sounds so familiar. I wanted to ask if I'm sure in your digging, you found like what kind of training do these people have to have, or like what kind of regulation is there around these machines? Does the government or anybody have any? I watched a really scary documentary called The Bleeding Edge or whatever. I'm not sure if you've seen it, about the device industry and how unregulated it is. So I wonder, does this TMS thing sort of fall in the device world, or
Yeah.
yeah.
Some of the big things that I learned about it were from the women in the bleeding edge. A lawyer told me to watch it as he was declining my injury case. So I got in touch with those women, and they told me more about the regulatory process and stuff and how it's not really regulated. I think it's a class 2 device. I don't know a tremendous amount about that. I contacted the FDA. I made a very serious accusation with a lot of medical backup. They took my accusation or report seriously, and they acted based on that. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, the most that they could do, or the most they would ever consider doing, is going and making sure that they're manufacturing the devices correctly, and they're not like, the devices aren't broken, or there isn't some problem with the production or the facilities or something like. So they don't even know what the therapeutic mechanism of action is. So there's nothing that they can do, or nothing that's regulated on whether or not this hurts human beings or not. Like all they can say is like, you're making this device, it's made correctly, and it shouldn't, I don't know, it feels like a farce, but like it reasonably shouldn't cause harm. I don't know. They have no specific criteria around it. They've given no consideration to the physics that the machines generate, because you can, in black and white, you can see that the electromagnetic fields that these give off, there is a well-established history of destruction of cells and harm. It's just in black and white. Like this research was gone back in the 60s and 70s. They showed that these electromagnetic fields destroy human tissue. And so the FDA, clearly that is not in their equation. They just approve it and it goes wherever it goes. So that means nothing.
But what about like the doctors who have it in their office, or the person who administers it? Like, do they just have to take a class or get like a license, or?
Yeah. So the people that administer it are under no governmental regulation at all. So an office assistant can run the machine, can put you on it and run it. The manufacturer says you should have training from the manufacturer. The manufacturer is the one selling these devices. The office staff that I talked to, they told me explicitly that the manufacturer, when they trained them to ignore patient complaints and turn up the intensity of the machine, irregardless of what the patient said, because it could not hurt the patient. So it gives you a frame of reference for the manufacturer's perspective on these machines. And they're not required to get training. They're supposed to get training from the manufacturer, so at least they know how to operate it. But that's kind of the framework there. So when you're getting the treatment, nothing's required. A psychiatrist, it's supposed to only be prescribed by a psychiatrist, as far as I know. So a psychiatrist is responsible for the treatment. Psychiatrist is not a neurologist. Their knowledge of electrophysics and biomedicine, like nothing. Like, so again, like you present with a brain injury to a psychiatrist, they're not required to know anything or to treat you or to do anything at all, right? So the situation is an impossible one. Even if you report brain injury and you have direct evidence of it, they could still keep giving you treatment. There's nothing to stop them. There's no safety requirements or protocol or anything. Like there's nothing. And I looked into it. I reported things to my attorney general, to the FDA, to hundreds of attorneys, and no one will do anything because it's like the Wild West is the way I looked at it. I started looking into this stuff. I'm like, there's no regulation, there's no accountability. I had to do years worth of research just to find out like how the machines work and how they administered the energy that they did administer, right? And the people, aside from the people that originally researched and designed and developed the devices and why, they're the only, my guess is they're the only ones that even know what's actually happening with it. And they want it that way. The engineers that made the devices, they got paid to do their job. And then the manufacturers that develop them, just like with psychiatric medications that are dangerous. I don't know. I forget if it was Zoloft or which one, but like they know that it causes suicidality in children. And then all these kids die, and then they're forced to, get audited in litigation like 15 years later, and it comes out that they knew from the get that this stuff was going on. It's the same thing here. Like they don't communicate this stuff, they keep it secret, and so the people administering it, they think they believe that it's perfectly safe, but it's not. It's extremely dangerous and harmful it's harmful to everybody. Everybody that gets on the machine will experience harm. It's just a matter of whether they physically manifest the harm and they're aware of the harm.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess in closing, because we're getting here close to time, I know you've done tons of research and advocacy around this, and you write about it. And so where is everyone who is harmed gathering? How can they find each other and share information if someone did suffer from TMS injury? And I guess in the groups, are there lots of people there who have joined since you were injured? I'm just curious.
Yeah, all this is really interesting because I'm at the forefront of the injury. Like with meds, like there's just so many people. There's such a community now, and you don't have to look very far to know that this stuff is harmful. With us, like it's still new. There's still a lot of confusion. There's a lot of people that probably don't even know they're harmed. So I started a group a couple of years ago. There's like 2,000 people in there. Some of them are looking to see if it's harmful. A lot of them have been harmed. So we get together and we share our stories and try to help each other. I have a website with an email. I started a podcast a little while ago to try to educate people. I have the articles. So it's all kind of new, and we're all trying to figure this out together, which makes it difficult, but also I think the support system is really good for the people that connect in the group. But there's not a whole lot like right now I have my Facebook group or our Facebook group, and we connect there, but there's a lot of information I put out there, but not a lot of places for people to connect. So the Facebook group is really the only place where you could come and maybe meet other people that are harmed by TMS, learn more about it, and share information. But yeah, I mean, I really hope that as we establish the legitimacy of this injury, that more people make more efforts and more strides to create other communities, like for us to have a more diverse voice and a more shared voice. Because even in my group, a lot of people come in and report really, really serious harms that are hard for other people to read. And if they've been injured, they're on like their second or third year of injury. And every time they go into the group, they're just seeing people that are like, I just got hurt. My situation is so extreme and severe. It's hard for them to read that on a daily basis. And I can only do so much. I thought I'd never say that. I never wanted to say that, but I'm really working on a lot of different fronts to try to help a lot of people. And there's a lot of confusion out there. So there's a lot of help that's still needed.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there crossover? Like, do any of the ECT harmed folks show up in the TMS group, or are they sort of separate? They keep to their own groups?
There has been some crossover. It's been kind of small. You know how kind of we're all part of this greater harm community once we've been injured. There are a handful of people in the ECT community that have identified the similarities between TMS and ECT. And we've gotten together and we communicate regularly and we share information. And it's really wonderful. It's really brilliant. But generally, I think here's the rub, Nicole, is that generally speaking, like we're all freaking harmed. And like it's very hard for us to do the things that we do. And like there was a time where I was like, I wish the ECT community would really like identify more with the TMS community. And then I talk to people with ECT every day that have ECT injury. Some people have ECT and TMS injury, if you can believe that. And their lives are so hard. And to expect them, you know, to build a bridge and to do all this kind of advanced kind of like community-based stuff, it's just an unrealistic expectation. So I haven't really seen any real joint efforts, but they are going on. I do have a very strong tie to that community and the leaders in that community, which without them, I wouldn't have been able to say half the things that I said today. When I learned how that TMS and ECT harms are almost the exact same thing, just a different application of the same harm virtually, all the pieces came together for me. And that's when I was able to write my later articles. And that's when I was able to really define, because a lot of the stuff that I said, there's no scientific precedent for it for TMS. So I had to go into the ECT studies and look at the ECT literature and talk to people that have researched ECT over the last 20 years and jump the gap and see that what electrical injury looks like and what that means. And then once I was able to do that, like we finally had an ability to substantiate the injury, because before that it was still just willy-nilly magical, like invisible, you know, treatments. So without the ECT community, we would be totally out, like in a much worse state. But that's where it is. Same with the med community. Like I work a lot with people in the benzo community and other communities, and we're so close, but we're all just helping each other out. Like at the end of the day, like I lend support and they lend support, but you know, we're still segregated in a lot of ways, but interpersonally, like we're very close.
Yeah, exactly. Like I said multiple times throughout, a lot of things you shared, I can completely relate to, and I did not have TMS. So, all right. Well, I think we're going to close here with one last question. Oh, for anybody who's listening, if you want any of the resources that James has to offer, we'll put them in the comments section if you're watching on Facebook. And then later when this is uploaded to YouTube, they will be in the description so that you can learn more and read and join the Facebook group that James has and all of those things if you're interested. So I guess our closing question then, James, is, you know, it's Mental Health Awareness Month, which is co-opted so much by these groups and organizations that send messages out about, you know, get help if you're feeling this way, or take medications, or there's no stigma in, you know, and we don't obviously want to stigmatize, and we want people to have help and support, but so much of the messaging is, for these therapies and things that we know can be harmful. So from the TMS perspective, or just from somebody who is harmed, do you have a message during Mental Health Awareness Month for, potential or would-be consumers, maybe who are struggling with something like you had, just a really shitty job that was making you anxious or depressed?
Yeah, that's an excellent note to end on. So I've been through the community and through injury for like almost 4 years now. And I had a lot of, again, before that, I was just a regular guy. I was like, if you have a problem, go to your doctor, like take a pill, do whatever, and then just move on. I've had a serious, serious wake up call, far beyond anything I've ever experienced in my life. And the biggest point of it, or the biggest lesson that I've learned is that, and some people joke around about this stuff. People think it's like heretical and like make these jokes about it, but mental health and the way it's presented to us is not a thing. Like, it's not a disease. It's not like your own emotions are not an enemy. They're not a fictitious thing brought onto you, because a psychiatrist or psychologist tells you you're depressed. You don't have a disease now. This is, for me, I'm not going to press this upon everybody, but for the vast majority of the people that I met, if not almost everybody, we were all dealing with healthy emotions and a healthy biological response to our environment. Like, I was going through extreme stress at work, and I told myself that I should not be feeling the way that I was feeling. And then when I went to a doctor, I took a pill to get rid of what I thought was, again, a different biological, like I was remedying a chemical imbalance in my head. I'm under that illusion. There's no such thing as a chemical imbalance in the way that's presented by psychiatry. Our emotions are there to, if I could go back and do it all over again, right? When I got stressed, I would listen to my feelings and my body, and I would say, okay, I should consider a change in career. Maybe this isn't healthy. Maybe the company I'm working for is actually just using me as like slave labor and pushing me as hard as they can until I break, and they really don't care if I break or not. I've seen it happens in 10, 20, 30 different of my coworkers. And it's the same thing every time. When you break, they do not care. My insurance required me to see a psychiatrist to pay for my leave while I was out. So my work in that way pushed me onto psychiatric drugs that were harmful to me, much like the movie, like Medicating Normal. You are pushed into physiologically harming yourself instead of listening to your emotions. Like, what's the lesson there, right? Like, we're not broken. Like, we're people. Our body functions in the way that it was intended to, and caring for ourselves and experiencing our emotion is, once I realized that that's where I needed to go back to, that's when I started experiencing healing. That's when all of a sudden my life made sense again. Because when I accepted that I needed to take psychiatric drugs for a biological problem in my brain, I started believing someone else, and I stopped believing myself. And while that seemed simple enough, it was a little sliver in my brain where everything that I did, I always believed that someone else knew better than me. And so it created a cascade of problems in my work life and then in my personal life, to where I would just take the treatments the doctor said because they're smarter than me. When my boss told me to work 60 hours in a week, they're smarter than me. They know I'll be fine. It's just keep going, and it cost me everything. It cost me my brain function. It cost me my bodily function. It cost me my job, it cost me everything that I would have hoped to have had at one point. So when you look at mental health, like that, your emotions are a real thing. Mental health is a real thing, but the way it's presented to us as a consumer product, where your mental health is taking a pill, where your mental health is, even a therapist you think will fix your problems for you. This getting help is calling a suicide prevention line, where your phone's recorded, and that if you say the wrong thing, the police are going to come to your house and involuntarily commit you. These are things that are worth thinking about, and our own thoughts on this stuff are far more important than the thoughts that are suggested to us, and that every single person should very critically assess these things and come up with their own thoughts and ideas about it, and take into their environment and the people that care about them and the information that's out there, but make their own determinations about it. The moment I did TMS and when I was doing TMS, I did not make my own determination about it. I was listening to other people, and it cost me everything. So telling other people is easy for me because it cost me everything. I have nothing to lose now, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's what I would say. Think critically about these things, like, because people are trying to do our thinking for us, and that should never occur.
Yeah. Giving your power away, and not being your own advocate. Can amen to that, James. Okay. So on that note, again, we'll put a lot of resources below for anybody who wants them. Thanks everybody for joining us for this live discussion. If you have not seen Medicating Normal yet, please check out the website at medicatingnormal.com for the many ways you can watch it. The film is currently on Vimeo and Amazon US, Amazon UK, and Amazon Germany, and we're coming to Amazon Japan soon. We are also on Films for Action and Hoopla, and airing on PBS and on the PBS app. Soon we'll be up on Apple TV as well. So we're getting the film out to as many platforms as we possibly can. You can also buy the film on DVD if you're in the United States and Puerto Rico from our website. Always check our events tab on our Facebook page to see more scheduled upcoming interviews like this one. And finally, if you want to support Medicating Normal, you can do so at medicatingnormal.com/donate. So thank you so much again, James, for coming and telling your story, providing all this great information about this intervention that I don't think many people know about, but they probably see it advertised all over the place, and just, informed consent and warning that people need to look into it and research before agreeing to have it, and just know what they're getting themselves into. So thank you so much. And I'm so sorry again for what you experienced. And I just wish you speedy healing. I hope we both get back to baseline soon. So thanks, James. All right. Take good care of yourself.
I really too.
Okay. Bye, everybody.